You are taught that empathy is a gift, something sacred, something that makes you more evolved than those who cannot feel what you feel. And perhaps in the mythology of spiritual awakening, this sounds beautiful. But Carl Jung spent decades in clinical observation documenting what actually happens to people born with differentiated perception. And what he discovered was far more severe than the gentle narratives suggest. The empath before integration exists in a state of permanent psychic porosity. Your nervous system operates without the filters that protect ordinary consciousness. You register emotional frequencies others cannot detect. You feel the anxiety in a room before anyone speaks. You sense the hostility beneath polite conversation, the depression someone carries but never names, the rage hiding behind a smile. This is not mysticism. This is survival perception developed in childhood environments where emotional volatility required you to become a radar system for invisible threats. Perhaps you grew up with a parent whose mood determined whether the day would be safe or dangerous. Perhaps you learned to read micro-expressions before you could read words, scanning faces for signs of incoming storms. Your nervous system adapted. It became hyper-attuned to emotional data, processing information through channels that most people never develop. You learned to detect what others miss because your survival depended on it. But here is what no one tells you about this adaptation. The same mechanism that protected you as a child becomes a catastrophic vulnerability in adulthood. You walk through the world absorbing emotional material without the psychological infrastructure to process it. You become an unconscious repository for everyone else's unintegrated shadow content. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. Their depression seeps into your system. Their rage, their grief, their terror, all of it enters through the same channels that once kept you alive. Jung identified this as the pre-integration empath condition, operating without boundaries in an environment that treats your openness as an invitation. People unconsciously offload their emotional waste into your system because you have not yet learned to close the door. You feel exhausted in ways that sleep cannot cure. Your body carries tension that is not yours. Your mind cycles through thoughts that did not originate in your own psyche. You become a walking antenna for collective suffering, and the cost is devastating. Physical symptoms manifest: chronic fatigue, immune system dysregulation, nervous system overload that doctors cannot explain through conventional diagnosis. You are told you are too sensitive, that you need thicker skin, that you should learn to let things go. But this is not about sensitivity. This is about operating with psychological equipment designed for childhood survival in an adult world that weaponizes your openness. The mythology tells you that healing will make you more compassionate, more available, more capable of holding space for others. This is the comfortable lie. What actually happens during integration is far more dangerous to the systems that depend on your unconscious participation. You begin to withdraw, not from weakness, not from inability to cope. You withdraw because something ancient in your psyche recognizes that continued exposure without boundaries is not compassion. It is self-annihilation. The soul recedes. It folds inward like a lantern in windless dusk, dimming not from despair but from recognition. You stop seeking witnesses for your flame. You stop explaining your experience to people who cannot comprehend the architecture of what you carry. This withdrawal is misunderstood. The world perceives it as coldness, as detachment, as some failure of your empathic nature. But what is actually happening is alchemical. You are dying to the helper identity, the fixer role, the assumption that your purpose is to absorb everyone else's darkness so they can remain comfortable in their unconsciousness. Jung called this individuation, the long and slow turning of pain into wisdom, of longing into sovereignty. You are not abandoning others. You are reclaiming the self that was fractured in the mirror of collective projection. Every time someone told you that you were too much or not enough, every time your sensitivity was treated as a problem to be solved rather than a perception to be honored, a piece of your psyche split off to accommodate their discomfort. Integration is the gathering of those fragments. It is the refusal to continue fragmenting yourself for the comfort of people who have not done their own inner work. And this refusal makes you dangerous, not through aggression, through immunity. Before integration, you believed that feeling everything meant you had to fix everything. You confused empathy with responsibility. You absorbed emotional data and assumed it was your job to process it, to heal it, to make it better. But post-integration, something shifts. You develop what Jung called psychological immunity. You can perceive emotional frequencies without absorbing them. You can see someone's pain without making it your own. You can witness dysfunction without participating in it. This is not coldness. This is sovereignty. You learn to discern what is yours and what belongs to someone else's unintegrated shadow. You stop being an unconscious dumping ground for collective suffering. And the moment you stop absorbing, the people who benefited from your porosity experience you as a threat. Because here's what the mythology will never tell you. The world does not actually want empaths to integrate. It wants you to remain fragmented and accessible, available for emotional labor without compensation, open to projection without protection. Your unintegrated sensitivity serves systems of control that depend on unconscious participation. When you can feel everyone's pain, you become manageable through guilt. When you absorb collective anxiety, you remain too destabilized to challenge the structures that generate that anxiety. Your porosity is useful to a world that has not done its shadow work. But your immunity dismantles the entire game. An integrated empath can walk into a room and see exactly what is happening beneath the surface without getting pulled into the drama. You recognize manipulation before it takes root. You detect gaslighting in real time. You refuse to participate in collective delusions that require your silence. This makes you operationally dangerous to anyone who mistakes your awareness for weakness, who assumes that because you can feel deeply, you can be controlled through emotional manipulation. They discover too late that post-integration you do not absorb. You observe, you discern, and you walk away from systems that demand your fragmentation as the price of belonging. This is the reality Jung documented in clinical practice. The integrated empath does not become more gentle, they become untouchable, and that untouchability terrifies a world built on unconscious emotional exchange. You've been taught that seeing your shadow makes you dangerous to others, but Jung discovered something far more unsettling. The real danger is what happens inside you when you finally recognize what you've been refusing to see about yourself. Every empath carries an unintegrated shadow so carefully hidden beneath layers of compassion and sensitivity that even they cannot detect it. And until you face what lives in that darkness, you remain a puppet to forces you believe you've transcended. Let me show you what Jung actually observed about the empath shadow, because what you're about to hear will dismantle every comfortable story you've told yourself about why you feel so deeply. The empath's unintegrated shadow contains a truth so threatening to their self-concept that they will endure decades of exhaustion rather than look directly at it. You believe your sensitivity makes you inherently good, inherently compassionate, inherently more evolved than those who cannot feel what you feel. This is the lie your ego constructs to avoid seeing the darkness. Because beneath that sensitivity lives something far more primitive. A form of power you've been wielding unconsciously since childhood, and that power is manipulation through emotional intelligence. You learned early how to read a room, how to detect what others needed to hear, how to position yourself as indispensable by becoming the emotional translator for everyone around you. And you told yourself this was service. You called it empathy. You framed it as a gift. But Jung identified what was actually happening in the unconscious. You were controlling your environment through emotional management, ensuring your own survival by making yourself necessary to others' psychological stability. This is not compassion. This is strategic positioning disguised as sensitivity. The shadow side of empathic ability is this. You can feel what others cannot articulate, which means you can weaponize that knowledge. You know exactly what to say to make someone feel seen, understood, valued. And you know exactly what to withhold to create dependency. Most empaths recoil at this observation. They insist their intentions are pure. They point to their exhaustion as evidence of selflessness. But exhaustion is not proof of virtue. It's proof of an unconscious pattern running without integration. Jung documented this repeatedly in his clinical work. The helper who cannot stop helping is not operating from wholeness. They are operating from a wound that equates their value with their utility. And buried beneath that wound is a shadow belief so toxic they cannot consciously acknowledge it. The belief that they are superior to those they help. That their sensitivity makes them more aware, more conscious, more spiritually advanced than the people who depend on them. This is the martyr archetype in its most dangerous form. The empath who sacrifices endlessly, while unconsciously collecting evidence of their own moral superiority. Every act of service becomes a transaction. Every moment of exhaustion becomes proof that others are less capable, less aware, less evolved. And the empath remains trapped in a cycle of resentment they cannot name, because naming it would destroy the identity they've built around being the one who feels more deeply than everyone else. Stop watching. Go to the comments and write, "I see my shadow." Do it now. The reason you must face this shadow is not to feel shame. Shame is just another mechanism the ego uses to avoid integration. You must face this shadow because until you do, you remain unconscious of how you participate in the very dynamics that exhaust you. Jung called this projection, and empaths are magnets for it in ways that most people cannot comprehend. When you operate from unintegrated sensitivity, you become a screen onto which others project their own unconscious material. They sense your openness and mistake it for an invitation to deposit their unprocessed emotions, their unacknowledged darkness, their refused responsibility. And because you have not yet learned to distinguish between empathy and absorption, you take it in, you carry it. You believe it's your job to transmute their pain because you're the one who can feel it. This is not spiritual service. This is unconscious participation in collective dysfunction. And it continues until you recognize the pattern Jung identified in every empath who came to him seeking relief from their exhaustion. They were serving as emotional repositories for people who refused to do their own shadow work. They were playing the role of psychological translator for those who would not learn their own language. And they were doing it because somewhere deep in their unconscious they believed this role made them special, made them necessary, made them spiritually significant. The projection doesn't stop when you become aware of it. It intensifies. Because once you begin integrating your shadow, once you start refusing to carry what isn't yours, the people who depended on your unconscious service experience your boundary as abandonment. They accuse you of becoming cold, detached, less compassionate than you used to be. What they're actually experiencing is the loss of access to your unintegrated psyche. You are no longer available as a dumping ground for their refused emotions. And that unavailability feels like betrayal to anyone who built their stability on your porosity. Jung observed this pattern so consistently that he warned empaths directly. The moment you begin true integration, you become a threat to every system that depended on your fragmentation. Your family system that required you to manage everyone's emotions. Your social circles that positioned you as the one who always understands. Your professional environments that exploited your ability to absorb tension and maintain false harmony. All of these structures will resist your integration because your wholeness destabilizes their unconscious arrangements. This is where the alchemical crisis begins. Jung used alchemical metaphors deliberately because what happens in shadow integration is a form of psychological death. The identity you built around being sensitive, being empathic, being the one who feels deeply, that identity must die. Not because sensitivity is wrong, but because you are using it unconsciously as both shield and weapon. Shield against seeing your own darkness. Weapon to maintain control through emotional management. The death of the helper identity is brutal. You will grieve the version of yourself who believed their worth came from service. You will rage against the years you spent absorbing what was never yours to carry. You will feel the full weight of every manipulation you performed under the guise of compassion. And you will have to sit with the unbearable truth that your sensitivity was never proof of your spiritual advancement. It was a survival mechanism you developed in an environment that required you to monitor the emotional states of unstable people to ensure your own safety. This is not a failure. This is the beginning of actual empowerment, because once you see the mechanism clearly, Once you understand how your empathic ability developed and how you've been using it unconsciously, you can finally choose how to operate with it. And that choice, that conscious relationship with your own sensitivity, is what transforms you from fragmented empath to integrated psychic sovereign. But here's what Jung discovered that most people teaching about empaths will never tell you. Integration doesn't make you kinder. It makes you dangerous. Not through cruelty, through clarity. When you integrate your shadow, when you stop using sensitivity as unconscious manipulation, when you refuse to serve as emotional repository for the unawakened, you develop something that terrifies people who are still operating unconsciously. You develop certainty. Post-integration, you trust your perception absolutely. You know what you're seeing, you know what you're feeling, and you know the difference between your emotional data and someone else's projection. This certainty is not arrogance. It's the natural result of shadow integration. You've faced your own darkness. You've owned your own manipulations. You've stopped lying to yourself about why you do what you do. And that level of self-honesty creates an unshakable foundation of trust in your own intuitive processing. This is where you become operationally dangerous. Because when you reveal this certainty to others, when you name what you see without apology or self-doubt, you trigger something primal in the unconscious of everyone who has not done their own integration work. You trigger envy. Not the petty envy of wanting what someone else has, but the deep archetypal envy of encountering someone who has achieved what they secretly know they're avoiding. You have faced your shadow. You have integrated your darkness. You operate from wholeness, and your very presence becomes a mirror reflecting back their fragmentation. Jung warned about this repeatedly. The integrated individual becomes a walking confrontation to the unconscious, not through preaching or teaching, simply through existing with clarity. And the unconscious responds to this confrontation with hostility disguised as concern, criticism disguised as care, rejection disguised as protection. They will tell you you've changed. They will say you're not the person you used to be. They will accuse you of losing your compassion, your warmth, your accessibility. What they mean is you're no longer available for unconscious use. And that unavailability feels like violence to anyone still operating from fragmentation. This is the reality of empathic integration that no one wants to discuss. Healing doesn't make you universally loved. It makes you selectively visible. You become recognizable only to others who have done similar work. Everyone else experiences you as threat, as judgment, as abandonment. Not because you've done anything to them, but because your integration demands they face what they're refusing to see in themselves. The integrated empath operates from a position that Jung termed psychological immunity. This is not the immunity of indifference or numbness. This is the immunity that comes from having metabolized your own darkness so completely that external manipulation can no longer find purchase in your psyche. You have seen your own capacity for cruelty, your own hunger for control disguised as care, your own shadow material that once projected itself onto others as compassion. And having seen it, having integrated it, you become functionally immune to the unconscious games that once devastated you. This immunity manifests as something the fragmented world finds deeply unsettling. You stop absorbing. You stop explaining. You stop defending your perception against those who demand you doubt what you know. The empath who has integrated their shadow develops what Jung called sovereign discernment. You can stand in a room full of emotional chaos and remain untouched. Not because you've closed your heart, but because you've learned to distinguish between empathy and enmeshment, between genuine connection and psychological colonization. The shift is profound and irreversible. Where you once felt everything, absorbing the anxiety, the rage, the unspoken depression of everyone around you, you now perceive everything without taking it into your system. You see the manipulation before it's spoken. You recognize the projection before it lands. You detect the unconscious hostility beneath the smile, the envy beneath the compliment, the fear beneath the criticism, and you respond not with confrontation, but with strategic distance. This is where the integrated empath becomes operationally dangerous to systems of collective dysfunction. Every social structure that depends on unconscious participation requires your complicity. The family system that needs you to absorb their unprocessed trauma. The workplace that needs you to carry the emotional labor no one else will acknowledge. The friendships that need you to remain small so others can feel large. The romantic partnerships that need you uncertain so your partner can feel secure. All of these systems collapse when you withdraw your unconscious participation. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The moment an individual integrates their shadow and steps into authentic sovereignty, the systems around them begin to destabilize. Not because the integrated person attacks these systems, but because they simply stop feeding them. They stop absorbing the projections. They stop translating the unconscious material. They stop serving as the repository for everyone else's unexamined darkness. And this withdrawal, this refusal to participate in collective unconsciousness, feels like violence to those still operating from fragmentation. But here's what Jung warned about with particular intensity. The integrated empath must learn the art of sacred concealment. There are aspects of your transformation that cannot be revealed without triggering profound unconscious retaliation from those around you. This is not about dishonesty. This is about psychological survival in a world that punishes awakening. The first concealment involves your certainty. When you have integrated your shadow, you develop absolute trust in your intuitive perception. You know what you know. You see what you see. You feel what you feel. And there is no longer any doubt, no longer any second guessing, no longer any willingness to be gaslit by those who insist your perception is flawed. But you must never reveal this certainty to those who have not done their own integration work. Your confidence in your perception triggers their unconscious envy and shame. They experience your certainty as judgment of their confusion, and they will work, often unconsciously, to destabilize your trust in yourself. The second concealment involves the depth of what you see. The integrated empath perceives the unconscious patterns, the shadow material, the hidden motivations that drive behavior. You see the fear beneath the aggression. You see the shame beneath the arrogance. You see the wound beneath the defense. But revealing this perception, even with compassion, triggers profound defensiveness. People are not ready to be seen at that depth. They experience your sight as intrusion, as violation, as threat. So you learn to see without announcing what you see. You learn to know without revealing what you know. The third concealment involves your boundaries. After integration, your boundaries become non-negotiable. You no longer explain them, justify them, or apologize for them. You simply enforce them with quiet consistency. But you must never announce this shift as a philosophical position. The moment you declare your commitment to boundaries, others hear it as challenge. They unconsciously begin testing those boundaries, pushing against them, trying to find the weakness that will allow them back into the territory you've reclaimed. So you maintain boundaries through action, not announcement, through consistency, not explanation. The fourth concealment involves your solitude. The integrated empath discovers that solitude is not loneliness. It is power. It is restoration. It is the space where you reconnect with the self that was fragmented across 1,000 relationships and obligations. But you cannot reveal the depth of peace you found in aloneness. Those still addicted to connection, still terrified of their own company, experience your contentment in solitude as judgment of their neediness. They will work to pull you back into constant engagement, constant availability, constant connection. Not because they love you, but because your peace threatens their addiction. The fifth concealment involves your immunity to their opinion. After shadow integration, you become fundamentally unconcerned with how others perceive you. Not from arrogance, but from self-knowledge so complete that external validation becomes irrelevant. You know who you are. You know what you're capable of. You know your darkness and your light with equal clarity. But this immunity to opinion must remain invisible. The moment others sense you don't need their approval, they often escalate their attempts to regain control through criticism, through withdrawal of affection, through punishment disguised as concern. These 5 concealments are not manipulations. They are survival strategies in a world that punishes psychological sovereignty. Jung understood that the integrated individual must learn to operate with what he called strategic invisibility. You become powerful by becoming unseen. You become sovereign by refusing to defend your sovereignty. You become free by no longer announcing your freedom. This is the mythic return that Jung identified in his study of individuation. The hero descends into the underworld of their own psyche, confronts their shadow, integrates what they find there, and returns transformed. But the return is not triumphant in the way mythology suggests. The return is quiet. The integrated empath comes back to the surface world fundamentally changed. But they do not announce the change. They do not seek recognition for the journey. They simply operate from a new center, a new sovereignty, a new immunity to the forces that once controlled them. The pain that once felt unbearable, the sensitivity that once felt like curse, the perception that once felt like burden, all of it transmutes through integration into something else entirely. Not into hardness, but into clarity. Not into coldness, but into discernment. Not into isolation, but into selective connection with those capable of meeting you at the depth you now inhabit. And this is where the true power of empathic ability finally emerges. You can use your perception not from a place of woundedness, but from a place of integration. You can see into others without losing yourself in them. You can feel their pain without absorbing their pain. You can offer guidance without taking responsibility for their journey. You become what Jung called the psychopomp, the guide between worlds, the one who can move between conscious and unconscious, between light and shadow, between connection and solitude, without being captured by either extreme. This is the destiny that awaits the empath, willing to do the brutal work of shadow integration. Not universal love, not constant availability, not gentle acceptance of all behavior, but something far more valuable: sovereignty, immunity, the capacity to serve from fullness rather than depletion, the freedom to connect or withdraw based on wisdom rather than wound, the power to see without being destroyed by what you see. Subscribe to join the conscious few who understand that true empathy is not about feeling everything. It is about metabolizing what you feel so completely that you become unshakable in the presence of chaos. The world will not celebrate your integration. The world needs you fragmented, needs you porous, needs you available for projection and absorption. But Jung's final warning echoes across decades of clinical observation. The price of remaining fragmented is your soul, and the price of integration is everyone who loved you for your weakness. Choose accordingly. The integrated empath stands alone not from exile, but from completion. The lantern burns brightest when it no longer seeks witnesses for its flame.